大家好，我们今天时间比较宝贵而且时间也不早，所以我们今天还是准时开始。首先呢是这样，我们非常高兴能够邀请到我们Steven Briggs 教授来为我们今天主讲这样的一个课堂。这个机会非常难得，在我们的宣传当中，我们之所以把它命名为这是一个彩蛋，主要的原因是因为前期在邀请Briggs 教授的时候呢，他是比较忙碌的。不太容易能找到，所以呢，最后在我们的整个活动的进展过程中，终于能够收到他的回信，然后呢，非常高兴他听到我们有主办这样的一个活动非常积极愿意来参加我们这样的一个主讲，所以呢，我们就把这样的一个活动把它叫做彩蛋然后呢，首先简单的介绍一下我们Briggs 教授我们 Briggs 教授呢是英国艾克塞特大学的教授。同时呢，他也是英国东伦敦大学的荣休教授，以及英国精神分析委员会的成员 t a v i s t o 心理治疗师学会的成员，并且呢，很重要的一点是，他是NICE 智商指南发展小组的成员。他的研究方向呢，主要是青少年心理治疗，并且他是TAPP 的一个研发发展者。他的著作是有一本著作是关于智商与叫做关于智商与自杀的一本著作。
Okay, so we are very honored to have Dr. Steven Briggs to offer this lecture for us. We call it a surprise because previously we have no idea whether we can have this chance to invite Dr. Briggs for this lecture. But we made it, we managed to find the time. So we call it a surprise to everyone. Dr. Steven Briggs is professor of University of Exeter and emeritus professor of University of East London. And he is a certified psychoanalyst with the British Psychoanalytic Council, and he is a member of national guideline development groups of National Institute of Clinical Excellency. His research area is working with adolescents and young adults. He is also the founder of time-limited adolescent psychodynamic psychotherapy, and he has published relating to self-harm and suicides in 2008.
然后呢，今天呢，他主讲的话题呢，就是跟动力学有关。因为呢，相信大家一直在跟着我们这个系列讲座，都知道我们前面的大部分的主题都是行为学、认知，或者是一些关于智商与自杀的一些科普知识。今天我们比较专注在这个动力学领域，并且呢，也邀请到Briggs 教授呢，能够把他开发的 TAPP 介绍给大家。
As we know, today's topic is about dynamic approach psychotherapy. And previously, our series of lectures focused on behavioral level, cognitive level, and also research on self-harm issues. But today, we are very happy to introduce TAPP, psychodynamic approach psychotherapy for everyone.
当然有这么好的一个老师来为我们讲这个话题，我们当然也要能够邀请到好的翻译，所以再次我们很高兴能够邀请到王旭老师为我们承担本场的这个主义。王旭老师是清华大学的心理学硕士，中国心理学会注册心理师，清华大学心理发展指导中心的心理咨询师，而且很重要的一点，他是精神动力学取向的资深翻译，所以这一场是应该会很精彩。
And today's translator is Mr. Wang Xu. He is working in a university as a school counselor, and he's also a licensed psychologist. And his approach is psychodynamic, so it is very appropriate for him to translate this lecture.
好，最后就是不花大家不占用大家太多的时间，我们呢最后每一次开始之前还是要提醒大家，有任何的问题请在留言板上留言，我们会选择一些恰当的问题跟老师进行后续的沟通。那么我就讲那么多，接下来就把这个话筒交给老师和我们的王旭老师。
And we invited all the participants to leave their questions and comments in this platform, and we will select and translate it to our lecturer after the lecture. So we can start. So
Okay.
would you please share your screen?
Yep. Did that
Yes.
work?
Yes, we can see it.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to be giving this talk today. I think what I've said on that slide has already been said by way of introduction. So shall I go?
Yep.
I'll go. If that's okay, I'll go straight on.
好，那很高兴很高兴得到邀請來給大家做這一場講座。那麼我們現在就開始今天講座的內容。Okay, we can proceed.
Okay. So I need to start with thinking about describing what is self-harm, because there are multiple and confusing definitions of it. Some of the problems are that to do with the relationship between self-harm and suicide, the methods used, intentions, and outcomes. And the definition that I'm using is the one that's used by the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in the UK. It's any act of intentional harm to the self, irrespective of method used or intended outcome, therefore including suicide attempts.
好，
Self-harm.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Sorry. 那首先我们需要思考的问题是什么是自我伤害？因为在自我伤害这一个词汇下面有着非常不同，并且会让人感觉困惑的定义。其中的一个重要问题是自伤和自杀之间的关系，使用的方法、意义、还有意图、还有结果上面都有哪一些异同。我们对自伤的定义是这么样的，采用的是NICE 的定义，就是任何一种故意伤害自己的行为，无论他使用什么样的方法或者预期的结果是什么，所以自伤也包括自杀尝试。Okay,
thank you. So methods commonly include self-cutting, self-poisoning, hanging, jumping, use of firearms, and so on.
所以说，如果说方法的话，那可能就包括自己割伤自己、服毒、上吊、从高处跳下、使用枪支等等。
So why is this definition important? Well, the implications of the future self-harm and suicidal behavior. Self-harm is the most significant risk factor for increased risks of suicide and repeated self-harm. Risks of suicide increase dramatically after an episode of self-harm. And recently, thoughts of suicide have now been shown to also indicate higher risk for suicide completion.
Yeah, okay. 那为什么这一个定义非常的重要呢？是因为这个自伤，它对未来的自伤和自杀行为都是有影响的。自伤是未来自杀风险增加和自伤行为发生反复的一个最重要的风险因素，而且发生了自伤之后，随后的自杀风险也会急剧的增加。现在已经有研究证实，自杀意念也会指示出更高的自杀身亡的风险。
And there are implications for how we think about the methods used in self-harm. So there's a myth that the self-harm method indicates levels of suicide risks. Some methods indicate more serious suicidal intent than others. Whereas in reality, methods are not linked with outcomes in the longer term. Young people use multiple methods and different methods for different episodes. And for example, self-harm by cutting increases the risk of suicide completion in the longer term.
并且就是这一个自伤的定义会影响我们对于方法的理解和思考。有一些就是留言是认为自伤的方法可以指示出随后自杀风险的高低，也就是说，认为某一些方法会代表着他未来有更严重的自杀意图，但这个是不对的。现实的情况是，他使用什么方法和他未来的这个后续发展是无关的。年轻人会使用各种各样的方法，并且针对不同的情景，使用的方法也不一样。比如说，就是这个割伤自己，其实研究也证明，它也会增加未来自杀身亡的风险。
Thank you. So here's a very brief case example to illustrate this. Would you like to read it, Shu?
OK， 好，那下面就是一个非常简短的案例来呈现这一点，关于动机和意图和动机的关系。唐娜是一名16岁的女性，最近开始接受治疗。她告诉治疗师她的自杀的感受和行为。她微笑着前来治疗，说自己为了按时过来是跑过来的，并且很高兴见到她的治疗师。治疗师说，令她感到绝对惊讶的是，她的举止并不表现她正在挣扎。唐娜用非常平静的声音分享了昨天她想自杀的事情。唐娜告诉她的治疗师，她在校园里有一次严重的惊恐发作，然后逃离了校园。接着她说，她对某一个商店真的很恼火，因为她现在只销售8片一板的药物。唐娜继续说，她给男朋友发了短信，因为她不想打电话，她的电话没钱了。男朋友打电话给她，因为她真的很担心。男朋友打电话给警察和唐娜的一个朋友，而后者给唐娜打电话，试图说服她不要结束自己的生命。唐娜说受够了，再见，并且挂断了电话。唐娜说，然后她去了一栋楼的屋顶，警察来了的时候，一开始找不到她，因为她躲起来了，在墙的后面坐着。警察以为她真的就要跳楼了。
Thank you. So the question about intention and motivation is, in this example, does Donna wish to die, or is she seeking attention?
所以就是在这个案例里面，我们需要思考她的意图和动机。唐娜真的想死吗？还是说她是想在寻求关注呢？
Sorry. There we are. So again, we have a bit of a myth that some people intend to die and others are not serious and are seeking help and attention. In reality, most, if not all, suicidal people are ambivalent about living and dying. Conscious intentions change over time and between episodes. And it's more helpful to think of an inner tension or conflict between suicidal intentions and a wish to live. The notion of non-suicidal self-injury is an outcome, not a prediction, a false dichotomy, and can be dangerous when applied prospectively.
在这里面也会有一些留言，人们可能会以为有些人也许真的是想死，而另一些人想死的动机可能不是那么严重，他们只是想要寻求帮助或者关注。但实际上的现实情况是，大多数有自杀倾向的人，其实他们都对于生命和死亡存在着矛盾，而且意识层面的意图常常会随着时间和情景发生变化。所以说，思考自杀意图和生活愿望之间的内在张力和冲突，可能是更有帮助的。有一个定义叫做非自杀自伤，这个概念界定的是结果，而不是对未来的预测。而且这个其实是一种错误的二分法，把它用于前瞻可能是有危险的。
Thank you. So just to recapitulate, risks, definitions, methods, motives, and outcomes. There's the definition of self-harm I've already read. And why this definition? Well, conscious intention is not a good guide. Intention changes over time and is often multiple, both wanting to die and seeking attention, for example, and it's ambivalent. Methods of self-harm are not linked with outcomes. An episode of self-harm is a significant risk factor for repetition and suicide completion.
所以我们在这里再次重述一下关于自伤的风险定义、它的方法、动机以及结果。这一个自伤的定义，刚才我已经讲过了。为什么我们使用这一个定义？就是因为意识层面的意图，常常是随着时间而变化的，而且就是其中也常常是包含着矛盾性的。这个自伤的方法和最终的结果是无关的，并且自伤的事件是随后自杀死亡的一个重要的风险因素。Okay.
Thank you. So, in the therapist's chair, anxieties and risks. When you're facing working with self-harm and suicide, working with young people, the encounter involves intense emotions and stirs up anxieties in therapists and others in contact with them.
这个在治疗师的位置上会体验到什么样的焦虑和风险？当面对有自杀或者自伤倾向的年轻人，会激发起治疗师的非常强烈的情绪。
So the anxieties for the therapist include not knowing, uncertainty, problems of prediction, feeling a lack of expertise, fear of blame.
对于治疗师对于治疗师来说，治疗师会体验到的焦虑，包括他不知道这种不确定性，还有是否能够预测出未来走向的问题，以及感觉自己缺乏专业知识，害怕被指责。
When we're anxious, we use our defenses. So we have both individual and organizational or institutional defenses against anxiety. We like to seek certainty and simple solutions rather than facing ambiguous and ambivalent realities. We adopt myths in teams and groups, and we resort to ritualized practices rather than individual emotional involvement. People in distressed or disturbed. Do you want to do that bit?
That's okay. That's okay.
Yeah. People in distressed or disturbed states affect the caregiver. They nudge or pull the therapist to play a part in the internal self-harm conflict. And thinking about these feelings, if we can bear to think about them, can inform interventions and prevent enactments.
当我们感觉到焦虑的时候，我们就会使用自己的防御，对抗焦虑。有的这个个体的防御，也有组织性的防御，包括寻求确定性和一种简单的解决方案，而不是面对模棱两可还有矛盾的现实。有的时候会在团队和群体当中传播那一些流言，或者说使用一些仪式化的操作形式，处于痛苦或者不安状态的人，会影响到他们的照顾者，他们会推动或者拉扯治疗师，在他们的内在自伤冲突中扮演一个角色。如果我们能够容忍并且思考这一些感受，就可以为干预提供信息，并且预防这一种事情的活现。
So I'm going to give two examples of anxieties and what we call countertransference, two different kinds of cases. And perhaps I could ask you to just read the first case.
我们在这里面呈现2个案例，就是关于青少年自伤引发的焦虑和反移情的。先是索尼娅的案例，它激起了治疗师的焦虑。 17岁的索尼娅说，她过量服药是因为她放弃了生命，因此她被动的绝望立刻就引发了关注。她从未见过自己的父亲，在她的青春期，她的母亲那时候沉溺于自己的关系当中，令索尼娅无法接近母亲。索尼娅对父亲的好奇心越来越大，这种好奇心是在认为她找不到任何好的东西的背景下发展出来的。她对她父亲产生了许多想法，认为他已经死了，是吸毒成瘾者等等。她越来越觉得父亲抛弃了自己，并且觉得自己一文不值。然后她也放弃了寻找父亲的努力，并且在这一时刻，她过量服药，并且放弃了生命。她对自己感到绝望，感觉到被一个残忍的、暴怒的、带来伤害和虐待的父亲从内部攻击。这个内在的父亲似乎在告诉她，他是无用的，是一文不值的。
Okay. And then in contrast, here's a different kind of case.
然后作为对照，解码的案例是一个不同的这个反移情的例子。解码淡化情绪。16岁的解码被学校的咨询师转介接受心理治疗。学校的咨询师是一位经验丰富的人，他并未表示说他认为解码存在自杀的风险。解码的青春期早期包括危险行为和早期性经历，他理想化了自己的父母，并且为自己的行为感觉内疚，觉得自己让他们失望了。他对他的治疗非常怀疑，尽量淡化他的问题，并且试图保持对他的治疗师的一种表面上的依附。在8周内的5次会谈后，其中包括错过的几次，他说，而且不是立刻在治疗中说出，而是在会谈开始几分钟后才说。在上周最后一次会谈结束后，他有过过量服药。他说他参加了一个派对，他当前的男朋友没有理会他，感觉他与其他人有牵连。他回到家就吃下了20片到40片扑吸热痛。他的父母听到了他在呕吐，他被送到了医院。他告诉医院说他已经在接受治疗了，所以他就被送出了医院。
Sorry, carries on.
那种超然的感觉实在是太震撼了。毫不夸张地说，当他讲完了这个故事，接着就开始讲下一个主题。我产生了一种相当不理性的想法，就是假如我今天没有来见他，我可能永远无法听到他说起这个故事。这个想法反映出他的父母在他严重自杀的行为，发现了他过量服药的时候，父母感觉到的脆弱。解码拒绝更详细的讨论过量服药的原因，理由是说他根本没有任何自杀的念头，也从来没有过。他不知道自己为什么要吃扑吸热痛，他也从来没有让自己有过感觉到想自杀的想法。他不得不承认，他的行为也许表明他正在或者曾经有过自杀的倾向，而且他担心自己给妹妹们树立了一个非常坏的榜样，并且为伤害了父母而感觉内疚。
So I just want to look about some of the differences between these two cases. First of all, knowing someone is suicidal makes a difference. So this, with Sonia, suicide was out in the open. She made an attempt, but it's unexpected in the case of Gemma. Some adolescents are painfully depressed, bothered about their depression, and desperate to try to communicate about it. Others seem to find communicating about emotions their greatest difficulty. Adolescents like Sonia instill in the therapist an anxious sense that suicidal behaviour may ensue at any time. Often overtly depressed, these teenagers find experiences of separation extremely worrying. And correspondingly, therapists are particularly anxious about these adolescents at time of separation, including separations from the therapist at the end of sessions and at routine therapy breaks. On the other hand, adolescents like Gemma seem to not know themselves that they're at risk, and they create in the therapist a danger of underreaction or of feeling detached from and are strangely unmoved by the adolescent's predicaments.
那我们来看一看这两个案例的区别，就是能够知道一个人有自杀的倾向，这会带来不同。这个指的是在索尼娅的案例中，他的这一个自杀尝试是非常公开的，但是在杰玛的案例中，他是出乎意料的有了这种行为。那么有一些青少年，他们非常痛苦、抑郁，并且为自己的抑郁而烦恼，并且是非常努力的想要与其他人进行交流。但是另一些年轻人，他们似乎发现交流情绪就是他们自己最大的困难，做不到。所以说，像索尼娅这样的青少年，他们会向治疗师灌输出一种非常焦虑的感觉，即他们随时都有可能会自杀。这一些青少年经常是很明显的抑郁的，并且他们发现分离的体验常常是令他们感到痛苦的。相应的，治疗师在分离的时候会特别担心这些青少年，包括与治疗师的分离、治疗的结束和常规的治疗休息的时间。但是另一方面，像杰玛这样的青少年，他们似乎不知道自己处在危险当中，他们在治疗师身上会造成一种反应不足的危险，或者让治疗师感觉与青少年的困境脱节，或者治疗师会感觉非常古怪，没有办法被青少年的这些困境所触动。
I think this slide's a bit repetitive, but I'll say. So think about the countertransference, the feelings from the therapist in these two cases. And with Sonia, there's the anxiety about separation, which is very strong. But with Gemma, the countertransference is quite different, feeling unaffected or being unable to maintain emotional contact. But in both cases, suicidal young people aim to involve the therapist or significant others in the suicidal struggle. Therefore, recognizing and understanding the countertransference relationship is crucial.
那在这两个情况里面，治疗师的反移情也是不一样的。在索尼娅的这个案例里面，治疗师会感觉到强烈的焦虑感，但是在杰玛的案例里，治疗师的感觉是非常古怪的，不受影响，对这个病人反应不足。但是有自杀倾向的青年人，其实他们都会让治疗师或者他们的重要他人卷入到他的自杀挣扎当中，所以去认识和理解移情反移情关系是至关重要的。
And it's interesting, attachment on the body, it's interesting that the countertransference patterns I'm describing here map closely onto the attachment patterns of suicidal young people. In a research study, we found that suicidal young people were, first of all, more insecure than non-suicidal peers, but they were equally divided between insecure categories of attachment, dismissing and preoccupied. And the differences between the groups were that they generated different narratives for dealing with emotional difficulties. The preoccupied group, like Sonia, anxiously hyper-emphasized their problems without prioritizing. And the dismissing group, like Gemma, played down and negated their difficulties.
下面我们讲一讲依恋和身体。非常有意思的是，我描述的这种反移情模式，与自杀倾向的年轻人的依恋模式是紧密相关的。在我们进行的一项研究中，我们发现有自杀倾向的年轻人比没有自杀倾向的同龄人，更是有着不安全型的依恋类型，而且他们在两种不安全型的依恋上是平均分布的，就是痴迷型和疏离型。但是在这两组人之间也有差异。他们处理情绪困难而生成的叙述是不一样的。痴迷型的群体，如同索尼娅，他们会非常焦虑的过分强调他们的问题，而没有考虑事情的优先级。但是像疏离型的群体， 就像解码那样，会淡化并且否定他们的困难。
So how do we understand adolescent self-harm? Well, overall, what in psychoanalytic thinking has been called the suicide relational constellation. There's a dyadic internal conflict. There's always two people involved. And the question is, who is hurting what or whom? And suicide is a perceived solution from variable internal states of mind. And alongside this, an unconscious motive is to have an effect on others or change the nature of a relationship with others. Do you want to do that, Shu?
OK，那非常重要的是，我们如何理解青少年身上发生的这些自我伤害。在精神分析里面，我们把这个称作是自杀这样的一种现象的关系层面的构成，也就是在这个自杀现象背后，其实都是存在着内在世界的二元冲突的。这个二元冲突的本质是，到底是谁在伤害着什么或者谁？而且自杀是面对无法忍受的心灵内在状态的时候，这个人感知到的一种解决方案，但他的一个潜意识的动机是对他人产生影响，或者改变与他人的关系。
Thank you. So with adolescent self-harm, I think there are 4 dimensions that are very important to think about. And just I've put all 4 into the talk, but because of time, I'm just going to focus today on the first and the fourth of these. Suicidal thoughts and behavior indicate a breakdown in the adolescent developmental process. And then the fourth one is suicidality in adolescence is a sign of the failure of containment.
好，那这个关于青少年的自我伤害，我们有如下的这4个重要的需要考虑的领域。但是今天因为时间的原因，我重点讲第1点和第4点。第1点是自杀的意念和行为表明了青少年在发展过程中的崩溃。第4点是青春期的自杀倾向是涵容失败的标志。
So the adolescent developmental process and developmental breakdown. The developmental process in adolescence involves interactions between anxieties, defenses, object relations, present and past relatedness, and social all happening in the social context that the adolescent is living in. And there's an extraordinary range of different ways of processing the mental pain, confusion, and conflict, which are initially stirred up by the physical changes taking place at puberty.
那关于青少年的发展过程以及这一个发展过程的崩溃，是这样的：青少年的发展过程涉及焦虑、防御、客体关系，现在和过去的关联，所有的这一切都在一个大的社会环境中，相互的在起作用的。这个一系列的青少年会发展出一系列的不同寻常的方法，旨在处理最初是由于发育期的启动而带来的身体变化所引发的一系列的精神痛苦、困惑和冲突。
Donald Winnicott, very famous British psychoanalyst, said, in fact, exists only one real cure for adolescence, maturation. This and the passage of time do in the end result in the emergence of the adult person, but the process cannot be hurried up, though indeed it can be broken into and destroyed by clumsy handling, or it can wither up from within when there is psychiatric illness in the individual. In simple words, there's a process of growth and development taking place, and it takes time.
那温尼科特是一位这个儿童精神分析学家，他指出，事实上只有一种真正的治疗青春期的方法，那就是成熟的过程。这和时间的流逝，最终导致了成人的出现。这个过程无法匆忙进行， 然而它可能确实会被笨拙的处理侵扰和破坏，或者当个体患有精神疾病的时候，它就会从内部枯竭。我们可以非常简单的来说，它的意思其实就是发展成长是一个过程，并且这个过程需要时间。
Moses and Egley Lowther focused on developmental breakdown in adolescence, and they said that if the developmental process in adolescence either is seriously interfered with by internalized conflict or has stopped as a result of a breakdown in functioning, then treatment is not only indicated but urgent.
摩西劳福和埃格莱劳福他们提出，如果青春期的发展过程受到内化冲突的严重干扰，或者说由于功能性的崩溃而停止的话，那么治疗就不仅仅是需要的，而且是非常紧迫的了。
So the adolescent process involves a whole process of reworking relating to self and others. Robin Anderson and Anna Dartington said the adolescent is required to examine every aspect of the lost object, the lost relationship, to pick up each particular aspect of the relationship, explore it, remember it, and face the loss in order to let it go.
那这个下面我们来讲一讲青春期的过程。这个安德森和达廷顿提出，青春期的这一个过程其实是再次加工与自己还有与他人的关联的过程。青少年被要求要检查那一些丧失掉的客体、丧失掉的关系的每一个方面，重新拾起关系的每一个特定的面貌，去探索它，并且记住它，以便去面对丧失，以便能够放手。
So loss of childhood ways of relating and of childhood ways of depending on adult and parental figures is really important in this adolescent process. And Anderson says all of us grapple with failed mourning to some extent, but for those who arrive at adolescence with serious impairments of their ability to face loss, this period can feel like an unbridgeable abyss.
这也意味着，就是这种一个人会在青春期的成长过程中丧失掉他孩童般的与他人关联的方式，以及丧失掉对自己的父母的一种依赖，是一个非常重要的这个青春期过程。安德森提出，我们所有人在某种程度上都要努力应对失败的哀悼，但是对于那些进入青春期但面对丧失的能力严重受损的人来说，这一段时期就像是一个无法逾越的深渊。
So what happens in adolescence is that we develop defenses against the pain and anxiety of the developmental process. And these can include, and I'll just pick out one or two, getting rid of feelings, letting off steam, acting rather than thinking, being ill physically rather than suffering emotionally, and using substances to become mindless.
瓦德尔就提出，在青春期的这一个特定阶段，青少年会发展出一些特定的防御，比如说会通过投射的过程来摆脱感觉，来发泄情绪，去行动而不是思考，或者让自己的身体生病，而不是在情绪上感到痛苦，或者说会滥用物质，让自己变得失去觉知。
So in adolescence, the whole process is about moving from being a child in the family to being a person in the world. And to accomplish this, the adolescent has to achieve becoming more separate from adult figures, the ownership of the new adult sexual body and its roles and powers in acting in the social world, ownership of capacity for thought, thinking one's own thoughts, separate from others, ownership of the drives, sensations, impulses, feelings, and powers. There's another one which you can put there. Problems and symptoms in adolescence stem from, this is the crucial bit really, these problems and symptoms in adolescence stem from disturbances in the adolescent developmental process.
那在青春期最重要的发展任务就是能够成为一个主体，因为在青春期，年轻人的任务是从这个家庭中的孩子转变成这个世界上的一个人。要做到这一点，青少年必须达到以下的这一些目标：他们要变得更加独立和分离，拉开与成年人这个父母的距离。他们要拥有一个新的成人的带有性的这种属性的身体，以及他们在社会世界中所扮演的角色和权利。他们需要拥有思考的能力，能够思考自己的想法，并且将自己的想法与他人的想法区分开。他们需要拥有驱力、感官、冲动、感受和力量的所有权。青春期的这一些问题还有症状，都是源自青春期发展过程中的阻碍，而青春期最重要的发展就是成为一个主体。
So the developmental impasse in adolescent psychopathology, this is about what happens when the developmental process goes wrong. Developmental impasse, what happens is that young people can get stuck on one side of the divide between becoming stuck on the outside, going into premature adulthood, or stuck on the inside, which is being stuck in childhood. And problems, symptoms are linked to these positions. So just to take both of these, precocious adulthood or pseudo-maturity. In this, the childhood-dependent relationships with adults are repudiated and replaced by an omnipotent sense of being independent, manic defenses. And it avoids painful internal conflicts and change in the process of mourning the loss of childhood. Whereas on the other hand, being stuck in childhood, growth and development themselves are repudiated. There's a fear of loss of control, for example, a fear of the body's sexual development. The aim is to retain childhood dependence on parental figures, and there's a fear of the social world and its challenges. Developmental breakdown is being overwhelmed by challenges of becoming more separate.
这一页呢讲的是发展的僵局和青少年的精神病理学。这个指的是当发展出现问题的时候，一个人会表现出什么样的症状。那它呈现出来的是一个发展的僵局，它要不然就是被困在了外面，也就是过早的进入了成年期，或者也可能是被困在了里面，也是困在了自己的童年里。所有的这一些问题和症状都和这两个位置有关。我们先来看看这种过于早熟的成年，也就是一种假性成熟的状态。这个人的自己的童年以及自己与大人的这种依赖的关系被他否定了，取而代之的是一种全能的独立感，也就是一种躁狂性的防御。他会回避痛苦的内在冲突和改变，回避对于丧失了童年的这样的一个哀悼的过程。另一面就是被困在了童年，这是对发展和成长的否定，是害怕失去控制，比如说害怕失去身体，害怕这个身体正在经历的性的发育。他的目标是保持住童年那样的对父母形象的一种依赖，而且对社会世界还有对社会世界带来的挑战是有恐惧的，所以这是一种发展的崩溃。对于被这种变得更加分离、更加独立的挑战所淹没了。
So in the state of developmental breakdown, the idea is that internally, the suicidal thoughts involve a relationship with an internal parent who's felt to have failed the self or against whom one has a grievance. So Moses Laufer and others have discussed how adolescent suicide is an attack simultaneously on the self's body, the external parent, and the internal parent. Suicidal actions involve this attack, but suicidal thoughts leave an area of doubt and retain some relatedness to the internal parent.
当这个发展出现崩溃的时候，其实他也在攻击着内在的父母，就是在他的这个精神世界的内部，自杀的意念也涉及了自己与自己的内心世界的父母的关系。在感受上，这个内在父母其实是让他感到失望了的，或者自己感觉在面对内在父母的时候，自己心里面是有委屈的。所以摩西、劳佛和其他人都讨论到，青少年自杀是同时攻击到了自己的身体、外在的父母和内在的父母的。这个自杀的行为是涉及了这一种攻击，但是这一个自杀的意念却留下了一个疑问或者一个模棱两可，那就是这个自杀的意念似乎也是在维持着与内在父母的关联。
So the other, I said there's two particular areas I want to look at: the impact of the developmental process, and secondly, is the idea that suicide in adolescence is a sign of the failure of containment. And I mean this in Bion's sense, that the containing function of the mother is to transform beta elements to alpha, to give names and meanings to emotional experiences. And a key aspect of this is to facilitate the transformation from a state of body to a state of mind. And what I mean by that is being able to think about emotional states. So suicide and self-harming states express emotionality as a state of body, relating to the body, investing the body with aspects of internal relationships and identifications. And the aim of therapy is to contain, through making verbal and mental, the dynamic or relational processes involved in the relationship with the body.
第四点就是青春期的自杀倾向是涵容失败的标志。我这么讲是借用了比昂的概念，母亲的涵容的功能可以将贝塔元素转化成阿尔法元素，既为情感体验赋予了名称和意义。这其中的一个关键方面是促进这一个人从自己的这种身体状态，转换到能够思考情绪状态的一种心理的过程。而自杀和自我伤害的心理状态，其实是将情绪表达成一种身体的状态，就是他与自己的身体建立了关联，使用内部客体和认同的机制投注到身体上面。而心理治疗的目的就是通过使用语言和心灵来涵容这些涉及到与身体的关系的动力或者关系的过程。
So thinking about what are the therapeutic priorities when working with adolescent self-harm. And there are three that I'll just touch on really. One is recognizing what I call the traumatic dimension. The second is restoring containment. And the third is understanding the meaning of who is attacking what or whom. And this draws on work by Schneidman, Ladam, and Moses Laufer.
那这个在处理青少年的自伤的时候，也需要考虑治疗的优先级。首先就是要识别在这个成长过程中的创伤的维度，其次是尽量恢复涵容的功能，还有就是要去理解自伤的意义，理解到底是谁在攻击着什么或者谁。这一部分的理论主要来自于施耐德还有拉达姆他们的这个学术的贡献。
I just wanted to skip through some of these points a little bit quickly, really. The problem is that after a suicide attempt or an episode of self-harm, I think we know that there's a very high rate of repetition. And one of the reasons for this is that the idea that it's likely to be a repetition because the attempt has left what Moses Laufer called a dead part inside himself. Sorry, I'm making this complicated, shoot. Edge Neidman talked about the state of numbness that exists after a suicide attempt. It's very common that young people will say that they feel numb afterwards. And Francois Ladame talked about there always being a psychic trauma. So a suicidal crisis can be understood as a psychic trauma. And because of this, the aim is in therapy is to try and overcome the freezing or rupturing of internal containment to restore the capacity to symbolize. Okay.
Yeah, no problem. 那就是我们面对的一个严重问题，是在自杀尝试发生之后，或者说在这个自我伤害发生之后，他们都是有极高的可能性会再次重复发生的。其中的理由，摩西劳夫是这么写的，就是当一个人试图自杀之后，会在心里面留下一个已经死亡了的部分，而这个施耐德提到，就是在自杀发生尝试之后，很多青少年都会进入到一种非常麻木的状态。拉达姆也提出，在自杀尝试的背后总是有心理创伤的，所以自杀的危机可以被理解成是一种心理的创伤。这个就带我们思考治疗要为这些青少年提供什么。治疗就需要去克服这种对于含容功能的这个冻结，或者说含容功能上出现的裂痕，让这个含容功能再次起作用，以便实现象征化。
So the aim of treatment, of psychotherapy, therapeutic work with people, young people who are either self-harming or have suicidal thoughts, is to restore symbolic thinking through containment, followed by understanding the internal and unconscious relationships involved in the suicidal conflict. And it's important then to differentiate those young people for whom sufficient containment can be provided through outpatient and also time-limited psychotherapy, and for those for whom this creates a dangerous and insufficient containment.
那治疗的目的其实就是通过含容来恢复象征性的思维，然后去了解自杀冲突所涉及的内在的和潜意识的关系。我们需要区分出那些可以通过门诊，并且时间也是有限的心理治疗，就可以为他提供充分含容的年轻人，以及那一些如此做法会造成危险和无法充分含容的年轻人，这两类人。
What I think are the criteria for sufficient containment are, first of all, the setting provides support for the therapist, that there are repeated assessment consultations, and a developmentally focused orientation to therapy, which should include the therapist's technical adaptation to working with young people who is neither a child nor an adult, but somewhere in between. And the specific assessment criteria are, first of all, that the adolescent stirs up anxiety in the therapist. So rather than feeling that feeling anxious is a bad thing, it's an important criteria, thinking back to the case example of Sonia. And the availability of a paternal transference, how negative. That is a complicated idea, but the idea somewhere is that there is a kind of, inverted commas, a bad father figure against whom one complains. And thirdly, there's the capacity for irony, or at least being able to respond to the therapist's irony as an indicator that there is a reflective capacity, irony being the first step towards being reflective.
那在门诊中能够提供充分涵容的一些标准，就是治疗师可以得到充分的支持，并且要有一个重复性的评估的过程，而且这一个治疗的重点应该是发展取向的，并且治疗师需要根据年轻人对自己的技术做一些调整，因为这个年轻人他既不是儿童了，但他也不是一个完整的成年人。说具体的评估标准的话，那就是青少年能够激起治疗师的焦虑，因为青少年能够足够的引发另一个人为他感到焦虑，这个是一个非常重要的治疗指征。我们可以想一想索尼娅的案例。第二点就是这个青少年需要能够充分的发展出负性的移情，不管这个移情是多么的消极。这个看起来会有点复杂，但是说白了就是这个青少年可以把治疗师感知成是一个坏父亲那样的人物，并且允许自己可以去抱怨。最后一个是这种讽刺反语的能力，或者至少能够回应治疗师的反语和讽刺。这个是因为讽刺它其实代表着一种反思，就是对事情加以这个正反面思考的能力，或者至少是反思的一个指征。
I don't need to do that. So what I'm going to do is, now I've got a little bit more time, is to move on to just describing time-limited adolescent psychodynamic psychotherapy with thought about how it can be used in working with people who are self-harming or suicidal.
好，那下面呢，我把时间用在向大家介绍这个在有限时间内的青少年心理动力学心理治疗，以及如何将它使用在有自我伤害问题的青少年身上。
So what is TAP? TAP is a manualized, time-limited psychodynamic psychotherapy for young people between approximately 14 and 25 years. It consists of 20 weekly sessions, followed by a post-treatment review, and is structured in 3 phases. There are 4 usually assessment and engagement sessions, 16 treatment sessions, and a post-treatment review. And TAP practitioner training is accredited by the British Psychoanalytic Council, and it is currently delivered in United Kingdom Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, CAMS, educational and primary care, and in private practice. And to date, the evidence shows that TAP treatment significantly reduces distress, problems, and risks, and achieves high levels of engagement, completion, and satisfaction. And there is a practitioner network and a website.
那么什么是这个有限时间内的青少年心理动力学心理治疗呢？那它是为这个14岁到25岁之间的年轻人提供的一种手册化的在有限的时间内开展的心理动力学的心理治疗。它包括20次每周1次的会谈，然后在治疗后有一个回顾，所以它的结构分成3个部分。评估阶段或者叫评估卷入阶段是有4次的会谈，然后是治疗阶段本身有16次会谈，最后再加上1次治疗后的回顾。这个TAP 的从业者的培训获得了英国精神分析委员会的认可，并且它在英国儿童青少年心理健康服务，还有教育和初级保健以及私人职业的场合都有应用。到目前为止的证据表明TAP 治疗可以显著的减少痛苦、问题和风险，并且实现了很高的这种就是案例的保存率、完成度和满意度。这个 TAP 也有从业者的网站在这里。
And the organizing principle for TAP is the view that through the therapeutic focus on a significant area of developmental difficulty and or disturbance for a time-limited period, the young person can recover the capacity to meet developmental challenges or have this capacity strengthened. So the therapeutic aims always take account of the young person's social and cultural context and differences of gender, sexuality and abilities.
TAP 的目标，它的组织原则是通过将治疗的重点放在发展困难或者说发展上的障碍的这一些重要领域，以便在有限的时间内，年轻人可以恢复应对发展挑战的能力，或者说增强这种应对能力。所以治疗的目标总是要考虑到年轻人的社会和文化背景，以及性别、性取向和能力上面的差异。
TAP combines 4 key elements. So it's working in depth psychoanalytically, including working with and working in the transference and countertransference. It provides an adolescent-centered approach to facilitate engagement and a collaborative therapeutic milieu. It has a psychosocial approach, especially to work, thinking about work with contemporary adolescent contexts and cultures. And it works dynamically with time limits.
TAP 它有4个关键的要素，它是一种深入的精神分析的工作，所以包括处理移情和反移情，并且在移情反移情中工作。它提供了一个以青少年为中心的方法，来促进参与和协作的治疗环境。它也是一种社会心理方法，特别适合结合当代青少年的环境和文化开展工作。最后，它是一个有着时间限制的精神动力的工作方式。
In working in TAP, the therapist adopts and maintains a therapeutic stance that provides a containing therapeutic space, and which is both supportive, promotes possibilities for exploration, as one does in longer-term psychotherapy. Conducting TAP therapy is usually an intense experience for the therapist, and support through supervision is an essential part of the model. This focuses on the supervision or discussion focuses on the meaning of the therapist's emotional experiences, the pressure she feels from the intensity of adolescent emotionality, and having to hold in mind a penumbra of ambiguities. Communications are always ambiguous and have many possibilities.
那这个治疗师需要采用并且保持住他的治疗性的立场，以便提供一个涵容的治疗空间，从而支持和促进探索的可能性。这一些都是像长程的心理治疗那样的。进行 TAP 治疗对于治疗师来说会是一种非常强烈的体验，所以督导小组的支持是这一个模型的重要组成部分。它会侧重于治疗师的情感体验的意义，他从青少年的情绪强动中所感觉到的压力，以及就是这个督导小组会提醒自己必须要专注在矛盾情感上。
Let's see, sorry. So it's very important that the therapist works dynamically with the time limits, practically to manage the number of sessions available, and also to enable exploration of the meaning of the time limit for the young person. And the power of the model stems from replaying in the transference the adolescent's experiences of becoming more separate and relating to others in a more adult way. The core, I'm missing the middle bit, the third one, the fourth bullet point is that core developmental issues of becoming more separate, owning the adult sexual body, one's own thoughts, drives and impulses in an increasingly powerful body and cognitive capacity are experienced in the transference, in the therapeutic relationship, and are felt and observed through the therapy timescale. In this way, the meaning of time and time limits is central to the process of change and growth.
重要的是，治疗师是在有限的时间内做动力性的工作的。这既是实际的要去管理可用的治疗次数，也是在治疗的过程中探索时间的限制对青年人的意义。TAP 的力量就源自在移情中重新上演了青少年变得更加分离，并且以更成年人的方式与其他人发生关联的经历。核心的发展议题就是一个人要变得更加分离与独立，要拥有自己的成人的有性的身体，并且在越来越强大的身体和认知的能力中拥有自己的思想、驱力和冲动。这所有的一切都在移情中得到了体验，并且在治疗的时间内加以感受和观察。所以说，时间和时间限制的意义，其实是变化和成长过程的核心所在。
So the aim of TAP is to produce one or more of the following changes as desirable therapeutic outcomes. Reducing distress and symptoms of mental health difficulties, whilst increasing the awareness of distress and its sources, enabling greater reflective capacity, including recognizing needs and vulnerabilities, increasing the capacity to take responsibility for one's own emotions, thoughts, bodily-based desires, rather than projecting these into others. Becoming more able to manage, name, and make sense of powerful and potentially overwhelming emotional experience. Through empathic connection with the therapist, promoting the development of more coherent narratives of self and relatedness to others, understanding internal experiences in connection with external social contexts, and recognizing characteristic defenses that restrict or impede development. And it's worth emphasizing that I do say at the beginning, the aim is to produce one or more of these, not necessarily all of them in a single therapy. That would be quite an achievement.
那 TAP 它的目标是产生以下的一项或者多项的变化，这个是一个理想中的治疗结果，包括减少痛苦和心理健康困难带来的症状，同时去提高对痛苦及其来源的觉察，增强反思的能力，包括识别需求和自己的脆弱，提高对自己的情绪、思想，还有基于身体的欲望负责任的能力，而不是将这一些投射到别人身上，变得更加有能力去管理、命名和理解那一些强大的，并且可能是超载的情绪体验，通过和治疗师的共情联系，促进一个更加连贯的自我叙述以及与他人的关系的发展，了解到与外部社会环境相关的内在体验，最后是识别限制或者阻碍发展的那一些特征性的防御。那么在这个幻灯片的开始，我也提到，所有的这一些是并不是说一次性要完成所有的这个变化的，只要有一些或者有一个，都是一个理想的状态。
So therefore, TAP does not aim to solve all problems in 20 sessions of therapy. It doesn't aim to reduce negative thoughts. It doesn't aim to eliminate troubling feelings or eliminate risks, though it does aim to reduce risks and symptoms through increasing reflective capacity. And a good outcome for TAP can be the young person's interest and engagement with their own internal reflective processes in relationship with another person. So in some cases, further therapy can be a desirable outcome.
所以我们也看看 TAP 不针对什么，所以它也不是说要用20次会谈就解决所有的问题，它也不只在说要减少消极的想法，或者说这个消除烦恼的情绪，或者说消除风险。但是尽管如此 ，TAP 也确实通过旨在提高反思的能力来降低了风险和症状。所以 TAP 的一个非常良好的结果，就是青年人可以在和另一个人的关系当中，对自己的内在 对自己的反思过程开始感兴趣，并且参与其中。所以在有一些情况下，这个人结束了 TAP 治疗，然后愿意开展进一步的治疗，可能就是一个非常理想的结果。
So in summary, really, the key aspects of TAP are that, first of all, it's a time-limited therapy, working therapeutically with time limits. It's a psychodynamic psychotherapy. It takes a developmental approach, and it's a psychosocial therapy.
对TAP 的一些关键方面做一个总结。TAP 是一个在有限的时间内开展的治疗，它是一种心理动力学的治疗方法，它采用了发展的取向，并且是一种心理社会学的疗法。
So, as I said, there are 3 phases to TAP. The first is the assessment and engagement phase. And the aim is the engagement of the young person in a therapeutic process, to provide the young person with an initial experience of it, to learn from experience what it's like to be in therapy, and to identify how psychotherapy can support and enhance the young person's development. It's also an aim to undertake a psychodynamic assessment of the young person's strengths, resources, difficulties, disturbances, and arrive at a view of his or her suitability for psychotherapy, and to assess factors for and against time-limited work. And then finally, and very importantly, to identify, discuss, and agree a developmental focus for the time-limited therapy.
刚才提到，就是这一个 TAP 治疗分成3个阶段。那第一个阶段就是评估和卷入阶段，它的目标是让年轻人可以卷入到治疗当中，为年轻人提供一个治疗过程的初步体验，也就是从经验中学习，让他体会到治疗的感觉大体上是什么样的。确认心理治疗是如何支持和促进青年人的发展的。对青年人的优势、资源和困难和困扰进行心理动力学的评估，并且判断他是否适合心理治疗。评估支持和反对开展有时间限制的治疗的种种因素。最后也是最重要的，那就是去确认、讨论，并且达成同意，在这个有限时间的治疗里面，这个治疗的发展焦点是什么？
Assessment. So this is in the assessment and engagement phase is usually in 4 weekly sessions, engaging the young person in weekly sessions, establishing ways of learning and relating, thinking between sessions, and so on. And then in the 3rd session, a treatment offer is made, including articulation of the developmental focus therapy. And in the 4th session, the offer is reviewed and contracted. And one of the important principles in the assessment is to identify and to relate to the ambivalence that the young person will have about therapy. Most adolescents are ambivalent in some way about therapy, and it's important to bring that in so that they don't simply drop out.
那评估是一个为期4周的会谈，它的目标是让年轻人卷入到每周1次的会谈当中，帮助年轻人建立起一种在治疗中学习和关联的模式，也就是他们可以在会谈和会谈之间开始思考、体验这个心理治疗的会谈，并且在第3次的会谈当中会推荐后续的治疗方案，包括阐明这个治疗的发展焦点是什么。在第4次的会谈中提供一个回顾，并且确定就是参加治疗的合约。在评估中的一个重要原则就是去识别出年轻人对于接受治疗的矛盾心理，因为很多年轻人对于是否接受心理治疗都是有矛盾的。如果能够识别出来，并且在评估阶段加以处理的话，就能够降低随后的脱落率。
So the crucial thing in TAP is to identify and work with a developmental focus. It's not work with programmatically. Once it's formulated, the therapy proceeds, as does any psychodynamic therapy. And the point of the developmental focus is that it is replicated in the therapeutic relationship. So the emotions and object relationships experienced around becoming more separate from parental figures, conflicts and tensions about developing more adult relatedness to others, pains and defenses against the emotional experiences of loss and change, and decision-making about the future transitions towards becoming more adult. So working with the focus in the transference relationship is a powerful way of achieving developmental change.
在这个TAP 当中，不会说针对这个发展焦点有一个固定的工作程序，就是说一旦在评估阶段确立下这个发展的焦点并达成一致，随后的工作就是这种常规的精神动力学的工作了。发展焦点的这些元素会在治疗关系中得到这个重现，他们的情绪、他们的客体关系都会在关系中上演。比如说，变得更加的与家长形象分离所带来的这个种种体验，还有就是关于发展成为更加成年人的和他人关联所带来的冲突和张力，还有体验到丧失和改变所导致的痛苦和防御，以及关于未来的决策是否要向更加成年的状态过渡，这一切都是在移情关系中进行的。移情关系是实现发展性改变的强有力的途径。
As with all time-limited therapies, once the ending starts at the beginning, as soon as there is a time limit, we're already talking about an ending. So an ending has been set. And though TAP isn't programmatic, there does tend to be a kind of beginning, middle, and ending phase to it. So the beginning begins with an ending, with time limits, the focus on depth, working with the relationship, and using the countertransference as a powerful way of understanding emotionality and relatedness. In the middle, the idea is that on what usually happens really, a cooperative working on agreed aims, relatively familiarity of process, pattern and content gets developed, and anxieties may be more depressive rather than projective or paranoid schizoid. But sometimes, as with adolescence, the middle never arrives. So sometimes have a beginning and an ending without a middle. And the ending phase, there's an intensification of anxieties about ending, about separating. And so it's important to contain these, to address as the effects of therapy as perceived by both the therapist and the young person, and assessing future options, and then linking this with the post-treatment review.
那么就像所有的有时间限制的心理治疗那样，这种有时间限制的心理治疗，它在治疗一开始的时候，其实就已经规定了一个结尾，所以从一开始的时候就已经在对结尾做工作了。所以在这个开始阶段，是治疗本身就是从一个明确的有时间限制的结尾开始这一份工作的。它是要聚焦在深度心理学上的，是处理关系的，并且会使用反移情作为理解情绪和关联性的重要的有力方式。而在治疗的中间阶段，两个人会就商定的目标进行合作性质的工作。焦虑可能会变得更具有抑郁的性质，而不是说去投射出去，或者说呈现一个偏执分裂性的焦虑面貌。但是有一些时候，可能这个工作也只有一个开始，人就脱落了，没有进入中间阶段。但如果一切顺利的话，就会再次进一步来到结尾的阶段。要在结尾的时候，焦虑会加剧，那个时候需要涵容这些焦虑，并且探讨治疗的效果，双方是怎么样感知这一个治疗的，并且去评估 未来的各种各样的选项。
We use the idea of Osimo's matrix to think about not feeling hurried when working with TAP. So the therapist has to overcome and eschew the temptation to become caught up with an anxiety to work quickly and cover breadth. And instead, the aim is to work in depth, repeatedly returning to the key themes to explore them in greater depth, and thus to understand the meaning of these for development.
我们在这里面借用奥西莫的矩阵来说明这个有的时候治疗师不能够急于求成。他说，治疗师必须克服并避免因为陷入焦虑而快速工作、增加覆盖面的诱惑。相反，目的是深入工作，反复回到关键的主题上，以便深入地探索它们，从而理解这些主题对发展的意义。
The ending phase is of vital importance in at least the last 2 to 4 sessions of TAP. The feelings and thoughts about ending and what it means to the young person are always preeminent. The end of treatment can stir up intense feelings. Regression is common in the ending, but actually what can seem to happen is the return to earlier problems, ways of relating. And if these can be recognized, then that can be helpful. The actual ending phase connects with, deepens, and recapitulates themes and issues that run through the therapy. And it links closely and inextricably with the processes of separation in the adolescent process, and therefore with the developmental focus.
那这个结束阶段，治疗的结尾的这个过程，也就是 TAP 的最后2到4次是至关重要的。在这个时候，关于结束的感受和想法，以及它对青年人的意义，总是非常关键的。治疗的结束会激发起强烈的情感，并且加剧治疗的核心问题。在这个时候出现退行是很常见的，会退行回早期问题或者关联模式上面。如果能够识别出这一点，会对整个治疗的升华有帮助，并且将这一些实际的结束阶段和贯穿整个治疗过程中的主题和问题相关联，进行深化和概括也是有用的。在结束，它其实是在治疗的一开始，同意接受这个有限的治疗的时候就确定下来了的。这个也是一个而且就是结束和青春期过程中的分离过程是紧密不可分割的，所以结束本身也是一个发展性的焦点。
The emotional experiences of the ending are depends on how previous separations and losses have been experienced for both young person and the therapist. And the ending usually involves a mixture of loss, sadness, anger, and also hope and achievement. And there is the ambivalent sense of being set free from a structure and also abandoned from it. The therapist can be under tremendous pressure to change the boundaries, and these must be resisted.
那在结束阶段的情感体验，往往取决于这个人他之前的分离和丧失的体验。对年轻人和治疗师来说都是如此。这个情感体验中常常是包含着丧失、悲伤、愤怒，但同时也包含希望和成就的一种混合体，并且会有一种非常矛盾的感觉。一个就是从这个治疗的结构中解放出来了，但是同时也有一种被治疗抛弃的感觉。治疗师这个时候可能会承受巨大的压力，想要改变边界，但是这样的一种想法必须要加以克制。
And finally, and briefly, the review meeting, which is usually 6 to 8 weeks after the end of the therapy, it allows for a trial separation, and it's identified as a time and place where some issues can be further discussed. And it's a space where therapist and patient can look back on the therapy from a vantage point of being now out of the weekly process but whilst the therapy is still fresh in both minds. So it's just part of a holding structure, allowing the sense of going on being, and one that can be helpful for containing anxieties and where practical decisions can be made.
最后是回顾性的会谈，这个一般是在治疗结束之后隔6周进行的一个会谈。它其实是允许在治疗结束之后进行一个实验性质的分离，并且可以对一些问题进行进一步的讨论，特别是未来的治疗选择。这样的一个会谈，让治疗师和病人可以脱离每周1次的过程，然后去回顾这个治疗。同时呢，治疗又在双方的脑海中保持鲜活。所以这种回顾性的会谈是抱持性结构的一部分，允许一种持续存在着的感觉，有助于涵容焦虑，并且可以在回顾性会谈中做出实际的决定。
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'll stop there. I've not left much time at all for questions. I'm sorry.
好，
Shall I stop the share? Shall I take the slides off?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
好，那谢谢各位。我在这里停下来，用最后的时间来回应大家的问题。
好，首先呢，非常感谢Briggs 教授准备大家可能也都看到了，这个材料非常丰富。其实后面还有一些幻灯片呢，我们因为时间的关系确实没有机会分享，但是呢，这个内容还是非常丰富的。所以我们首先再次感谢Briggs 教授能够为我们准备这么丰富的一个演讲，而且内容真的是非常的令人反思所以说要在这里先表示感谢。
So thank you very much for your rich material, and it is help us to reflect on these issues. So firstly, I want to express our thank to you.
好，那么接下来呢 ，Yeah，
Most welcome.
Yeah，OK。然后呢，接下来呢就是到提问环节，刚好这里有一个学员就是问了一个问题，其实应该是2个问题了第一个问题是怎么可以参加这个培训这个首先我这里简单回答一下，就是我们将来会跟Briggs 教授展开一些合作，大家可以先关注一下。那么这是一个培训相关的问题。那么呢，关于老师讲课内容方面的问题呢，是说需要评估智商个体是否适合心理动力性干预。我把这个问题换一个方式来问我想说的就是因为想了解，因为在临床当中我们很多的青少年个案，其实他对于这个要不要去接受治疗，或者是说很多时候是父母带着来治疗，可能当事人本身不知道他的动机和意愿情况怎么样，所以想问一下老师，在评估阶段，我们是说评估一些什么内容呢？还有就是说评估如果这个来访者他本身的想要进入心理治疗的动机并没有很强烈，或者是有些动摇，我们是试图在评估阶段说服他去治疗吗？还是说如果他不适合治疗，我们会把他转介到另外的一种治疗手段上面去呢
？So there are two questions. The first is how to take TAP training, and Dr. Guo says in the future we will have some collaboration with you. So please look forward for the further notices for the training program of TAP. And the second question is how to assess the self-harm individual, whether they are suitable for psychodynamic approach intervention. And Dr. Guo translates this question into another way, because sometimes we encounter the patients who was brought by their parents, and maybe the patients are reluctant to undertake in-depth psychotherapy. So our question is, what content should we assess in the assessment process? And if the patients have low motivation or they are ambivalent, whether we should persuade them to undertake this in-depth psychotherapy, or if we find they are not suitable, we can refer them to some other approach?
Okay, it's a really interesting and important question, and I'm not sure I can answer it quickly. I mean, maybe one quick way to respond to it is to say there is always ambivalence. That's really important. There's never an adolescent who is not ambivalent, because it's part of the developmental process, of course, to pull away from being dependent on adults. And on the other hand, you need to be dependent on adults in order to pull away from them. So when an adolescent is expressing, sort of ambivalence, I think it's very important to, I'll put it this way because there isn't much time. There's two ways that the adolescent communicates. One is through words and the other is through their feet. And it's very important to watch which way their feet go as well as which way their words go. And so you can get the adolescent who will say, well, I will come into therapy, but actually their feet take them in the opposite direction. And you can have it the other way around. The adolescent who, frequently I've sat in a room where an adolescent has said, I only came here because my parents told me to. They're sitting downstairs and they made me come. And actually, they're actually in the room. Their feet have brought them into the room. So there's something to work with. And I think that's the crucial bit. Is there something to work with? Is there a little bit of space where you can begin to think about whether it's possible to open up a conversation with the adolescent? I mean, if it's not, then you can't. If it absolutely isn't, if the push away to not be there is too great, then usually I think it's very important to engage the parents in thinking. And that might then contain the adolescent enough. The parents get contained, so the adolescent gets contained. And then there's a little space for the adolescent to pop out, as it were, and come into therapy. But I think they're the processes that one has to think about. I think it's always difficult to think whether another approach should be used without having kind of explored that with the adolescent, because they're likely to be just as ambivalent about another approach. We need some cooperation to do CBT, for example. So it becomes a question then, if there's risks around, it becomes a question of therapy and management. So how does one manage the risks and try and develop a thinking space with the parents and with the young person as well, in order to manage the risks that are involved. And there's always, when there's risks around, there's always some element of management as well as therapy. There are two hats that the therapist has to wear.
那这是非常有趣而且很重要的。
Sorry, I didn't translate that. I'm sorry.
No problem, no problem.
Just took off.
No problem. 所以这是非常有趣而且很重要的问题。我这个试着就是做一个回应。那首先我们要承认，所有的年轻人都是有矛盾心理的，就从来没有一个年轻人没有一点的矛盾，因为具备矛盾心理本身就是青春期青少年发展过程中自带的一个属性。他们想要推开他们作为儿童的那一种依赖，但是呢，他们又需要有依赖才能够去推开依赖，所以这就是青少年矛盾的本质。我们可以从两个方式去处理和观察这一些矛盾，就是去观察他们的语言是怎么说的，但同时也要观察他们的腿，他们用脚投票，他们的脚是怎么做的。有的时候我们看到这个年轻人说我愿意来做治疗，但实际上呢，他们的腿却经常让他们迟到或者不来。但有可能也会有反着的例子，就是也有年轻人会来治疗，每一次都来，准时来，但每一次都抱怨说是我爸妈带我来的，他们逼我来，我根本就不想做治疗，我爸妈就在底下坐着呢，所以我不得不来。但是其实是他自己的腿把他给带到治疗室里面来的。所以这个是一个关键，就是我们能够认识到所有的年轻人都有矛盾，并且看能不能开启一个空间，去开放的和年轻人讨论他们心中的这一些矛盾。如果说连这样的一个开放讨论这种矛盾心的空间都创造不出来的话，那么治疗可能就确实没有办法开展。通常在这种情况下，邀请他们的父母来就是思考孩子，来这个涵容青年人， 可能会对治疗的有帮助，因为当父母能够在治疗中，就是在这个父母会谈中被涵容，他们就可以去涵容青年人，那这个青年人可能就可以产生出更多的要来心理治疗的这种动机和愿望，所以这个是一个我们可以思考的议题。另一个我们需要思考的现实困难，就是转介给其他的取向，那么是否真的存在一个合适的其他取向，是对青年人更加有效的？说起来容易，但是想想看，把它转介去认知行为，然后就能指望他在认知行为中没有这些矛盾或者充分配合吗？所以也是说不定的。在这个评估青少年的过程中，也需要考虑他们的风险。所以一方面是提供心理治疗，另一方面是去管理可能出现的风险。这个需要有一个思考的空间。那他们的父母需要有这种思考的空间，青年人也需要有一个可以加以思考的空间。这个是治疗可以提供的，但与此同时，就是我们仍然需要管理青年人可能出现的风险。所以对风险进行管理和就是开展治疗，它是两只手都要抓，然后都要被治疗师考虑到。
那个老师的回答非常美妙，就是这个确实蛮有启发。然后呢，因为我看了一下，我们时间其实已经超时了，所以呢，这个今天就不再多提问。关于学员提到的关于 TAP 的学习的一些相关信息或者书籍，稍后我们都可以关注我们平台，我们会有一些信息的传播，会跟大家分享。至于后续的培训的话呢，大家也都可以关注。相信今天老师讲了这个 TAP 之后呢，不少人会对这个治疗的整个体系一些相关的问题等等都会有非常感兴趣那么呢，但是因为时间的原因我们不能再回答更多了所以呢关注我们平台和我们跟 Briggs 老师后续的合作吧。
Thank you for your wonderful, excellent answers. And because the limit of time, we have to end here. Some participants also ask about the future resources about TAP. We will share the material to the participants afterwards in the discussion group. And for those who are interested in learning TAP, we will provide these resources for them. So because of the time, we thank you again for your wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for your attention and for your wonderful translation. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a real pleasure.
那也感谢大家的这个聆听，我非常高兴能够有机会做这一场讲座，谢谢大家。Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. 王旭老师已经离开了